I used to live a life governed completely by data, balance sheets, and strict logic. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 65 years old, and before I retired, I was a senior forensic accountant, handling corporate mergers and fraud investigations. My entire life was built on cold numbers, legal contracts, and quantifiable facts. I didn't believe in miracles, I only believed in cause and effect. But on a silent Friday morning in the Boston suburbs, my entire world, my marriage, and everything I thought I knew completely shattered. It was exactly 8:05 a.m. My second wife, Eleanor, had just left our upscale home in Brookline, telling me she was heading to Sedona, Arizona, for a 3-day wellness retreat. She kissed my cheek, gently told me not to worry too much about our sick son, Julian, and drove her spotless white Porsche Cayenne out of the driveway. I stood alone in our spacious kitchen, listening to the hum of the espresso machine. For 7 years, our household had run on a rigid, suffocating routine. It all started 7 years ago during a family diving trip in Martha's Vineyard. Julian suffered a catastrophic equipment malfunction that cut off his oxygen supply. He was only 18 then, just about to take over the massive tech patent company left behind by his late mother. Since that tragic day, he had been confined to a wheelchair in a sterile first-floor medical room, suffering from severe muscle wasting and intermittent blindness. Eleanor took total charge of his care. To the outside world, she was a saint, a wonderful woman who gave up her successful art gallery career to care for her stepson. And me? I was the walking ATM, working endlessly and selling off assets just to cover the never-ending private medical bills, experimental treatments, and overpriced specialists. I was pouring my second cup of black coffee, enjoying a rare moment of peace, in a house that usually felt like an intensive care unit. Suddenly I heard something, a creak, then another creak. They were heavy, unsteady footsteps, coming from the medical wing at the far end of the long hallway. My logical brain immediately tried to find a rational explanation. Was it the morning wind rattling the old shutters? Was the oak flooring expanding? But the rhythm was too deliberate. It sounded exactly like someone walking, and it was moving right toward the kitchen. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I walked out of the kitchen and stared into the shadows of the hallway. As the morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a figure holding onto the wall slowly stepped into the light. It was Julian. He was walking. My 25-year-old son, who hadn't been able to lift a finger on his own for 7 years, was gripping the mahogany paneling on the wall for dear life. He was drenched in cold sweat, his chest heaving with every painful breath. His legs shook violently under the immense weight of his own body, his knuckles turning pale from the sheer effort. But he was standing upright. He took one step forward, then another. My ceramic coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Hot coffee splashed onto my leather shoes and ruined Eleanor's favorite Persian rug. I didn't feel the heat. I couldn't feel my legs. I forgot how to breathe. The laws of physics, the devastating medical diagnoses we had wept over, and the brutal reality I had faced every single day for 7 years vanished in a matter of seconds. "Julian!" I whispered, tears instantly blurring my vision. "Julian!" I rushed toward him, terrified he would fall and severely injure himself. "I've got you, son," I cried, wrapping my arms around his waist to steady him. "My God, how is this possible? I need to call an ambulance. I need to call your mother. She won't believe this." I fumbled for the phone in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I wanted to tell Eleanor to turn around immediately, but just as my thumb was about to hit the call button, a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. It was Julian. His grip wasn't weak. It was desperate and unyielding, locking onto my arm like a steel vise. I looked up into my son's eyes, expecting to see tears of joy or exhaustion. Instead, I saw pure, unadulterated terror. "Dad, stop!" he gasped, his voice raspy. "Don't contact anyone. Julian, you're standing—" I was completely overwhelmed by emotion. "You're walking. The doctors said you'd be bedridden for the rest of your life." "Dad, listen to me," he interrupted, his voice urgent and frantic, sending a chill straight down my spine. You need to listen right now. She didn't go to Sedona. I froze. The phone slipped slightly in my sweaty palm. What are you talking about? Your stepmother went to a retreat. She's not at a retreat. She's in downtown Boston, Julian said, leaning heavily against me as his body spasmed from the intense physical exertion. Dad, we have to leave this house right now. We have to get out before she realizes I've escaped that room. I stared at him, my 65-year-old brain struggling to process this overwhelming wave of absurdity. My son was walking, and he was terrified of the woman who had cared for him for 7 years. None of this made sense. Julian, you're not making sense, I pleaded, trying to guide him toward the living room sofa. Let's sit down first. You're overwhelmed, and the physical exhaustion is making you imagine things. I'm not imagining things. He snapped through gritted teeth, refusing to sit, his eyes darting toward the front door like a cornered animal. She's setting you up, Dad. Last night, she thought I was completely asleep, but I heard her on the phone. She's meeting her legal team downtown today, and right now she is freezing your trust accounts. On Monday morning, she's filing paperwork with the court to declare you mentally incompetent and deeply delusional. She's going to have you committed to a secured facility and take everything that belongs to us. The silence in the house became deafening. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. A secured facility? I repeated the words, feeling them turn strange and bitter in my mouth. Eleanor? Why would she do that? And how can you walk? What is actually going on? Dad, we don't have time to explain, Julian begged, pulling at my cashmere sweater with an incredible will to survive. You have to trust me. She will lock you away forever, and if she succeeds, I will never escape this place. Please, go get the keys to the old SUV. I wanted to tell him this was ridiculous. I wanted to tell him that Eleanor, the woman I deeply loved and provided for, the woman who supposedly sacrificed everything to care for him, could never do something so horrifying. As a forensic accountant, I needed an audit trail, logic, and hard facts. Just then, the phone in my hand vibrated, a sharp, brief buzz. I slowly looked down at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was an automated system text from my primary bank. That account held millions in cash from when I liquidated all my blue-chip stocks, specifically set aside to fund Julian's incredibly expensive treatments. I read the message once, then read it again. Urgent security alert. Due to suspicious legal amendment activity, access to your primary checking and trust accounts has been temporarily frozen. Please contact your private wealth manager immediately. A cold, heavy dread settled deep in my stomach. It was the kind of fear that tells you the foundation you're standing on is an absolute lie. It confirmed that my worst nightmare wasn't a dream. It was actually happening. I looked down at the broken coffee cup on the floor. The dark liquid was soaking into the hardwood, ruining the flawless surface Eleanor was always obsessed with maintaining. It was a perfect metaphor for my entire life. I looked back up at Julian, my son who had been written off as permanently paralyzed, now standing on his own 2 feet, begging me to save us from my textbook perfect wife. My wife, the woman who was supposed to be meditating in Arizona, was currently sitting in downtown Boston, methodically dismantling my life. I slid the phone back into my pocket. My hands stopped shaking. The confusion, denial, and shock evaporated in an instant, replaced by the absolute calmness of a top auditor who spent 30 years catching corporate criminals. I knew this entire structure was about to collapse, and right now there was only one safe exit. Hold on to my shoulders, son, I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of emotion. Let's go to the garage. We're leaving right now. I wrapped my right arm tightly around Julian's trembling waist. He felt incredibly heavy, his pale legs shaking violently from the sudden, agonizing pressure of supporting his own weight. We moved awkwardly but quickly through the long, silent hallways of the old house. The place felt entirely different to me now. It wasn't a safe haven anymore. It was a carefully constructed cage designed to keep us trapped. Every piece of imported Italian furniture had been bought with a massive, wicked lie about my only son's condition. We finally reached the heavy oak side door. Julian was gasping heavily by now, his face pale and covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. I quickly punched the code into the electronic keypad with a steady finger, and the heavy steel deadbolt clicked open. We stepped cautiously into the cold, dimly lit three-car garage. Right in the center sat our customized, heavily armored Range Rover. I had spent $120,000 modifying it with a complex hydraulic lift and wheelchair restraints. It was a massive monument of steel, built entirely on the dark deception Eleanor had woven around us for 7 long years. I threw open the heavy passenger door and practically lifted my exhausted son inside. Julian collapsed onto the soft leather seat, his chest heaving with sheer fatigue. I sprinted around to the driver's side, climbed behind the wheel, and slammed my thumb onto the engine start button. The engine let out a loud, grinding roar in protest, but it didn't ignite. I pressed the glowing start button again. Nothing. Just a dry, hollow metallic clicking that echoed ominously in the quiet garage. My analytical mind immediately classified the strange mechanical sound. This wasn't a dead battery. The ignition system was completely paralyzed. I jumped out of the seat and popped the heavy metal hood. Grabbing a high-intensity tactical flashlight from my cluttered workbench, I aimed the piercing beam straight into the engine bay. The breath caught in my throat. The spark plugs had been completely pulled out. The ignition wires were dangling uselessly next to the cold metal components. This was no mechanical failure, and it certainly wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate, calculated sabotage. Eleanor had intentionally disabled the large SUV before casually leaving the house. She knew Julian's condition made it impossible for him to ride in a regular sedan. She wanted to make sure that if I ever figured things out and tried to run, I wouldn't be able to go anywhere. She had intentionally trapped us in our own home. A wave of pure ice-cold fury washed over me. I slammed the hood down, the deafening crash echoing through the enclosed space. I looked around the garage, my eyes locking onto an old Land Rover Defender buried under a thick canvas dust cover in the corner. It was a classic 70s model that had been gathering dust for years because Eleanor hated the smell of gasoline and oil. I hadn't driven it since the day of Julian's accident. I ran over and ripped off the heavy canvas, kicking up a massive cloud of dust into the stagnant air. The doors were locked, and the actual keys were locked inside the house safe. There was absolutely no time to go back and search the house. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the tool wall, wrapped my right hand tightly in my thick wool coat, and shattered the driver's side window. Sharp shards of glass exploded onto the concrete floor. Carefully reaching inside, I unlocked the door manually and swept the glass off the worn seat. I waved frantically to my terrified son. Julian painfully dragged his heavy body across the cold garage floor, fighting for every single inch before slowly climbing into the dusty cab. I slid into the cold driver's seat. Without a key, I had to hotwire the vehicle. My wrinkled hands moved entirely on muscle memory from decades ago when I used to work on vintage cars. I ripped away the plastic panel under the steering column and found the necessary wires. I pulled out the thick red battery wire and the yellow starter wire, stripping the plastic insulation with my teeth before twisting the bare copper threads together. The dusty dashboard lights instantly flickered to life. I took the ignition wire and pressed it against the twisted copper base. Bright yellow sparks flew, illuminating the dark cab for a split second. The old engine coughed, protested, and then roared to life. I threw the shifter into reverse and hit the garage door opener on the visor. The heavy wooden door began to crawl upward at an agonizingly slow pace. It was way too slow for our desperate escape. I slammed my heavy leather boot down on the gas pedal, and the massive SUV shot backward. The metal roof rack scraped violently against the rising garage door with a sickening screech. We hit the concrete driveway with a loud thud, the tires screaming. I threw the shifter into drive. As I spun the heavy steering wheel, our headlights swept across the otherwise dead-silent neighborhood. An unmarked, all-black SUV was cruising slowly and quietly down our cul-de-sac. It had no license plates, and the dark windows were rolled all the way up. That was no friendly neighbor heading to work. That was a professional surveillance vehicle. Eleanor had actually paid someone to watch me. I immediately killed the headlights, plunging us into total darkness. I floored the gas, speeding away in the opposite direction through the manicured lawns and grand estates of Brookline. I drove entirely by memory through the winding streets. We drove in suffocating silence for 2 hours, the old SUV creaking all the way down to a gritty industrial area on the southern edge of Boston. I finally found a rundown motel with a flickering neon sign. I paid for the room in cash, helped Julian inside, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind us. "Julian," I whispered in the quiet room, "how long have you been aware?" Julian sat heavily on the sagging mattress. The blinking neon light from the parking lot cast long, distorted shadows across his pale face. He looked down at his trembling hands, took a shaky breath, and finally looked up at me. "3 years, Dad." He spoke the words so softly they were almost drowned out by the hum of the old air conditioner. 3 years. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 3 years, over 1,000 days and nights. My mind flashed back to the very beginning of this 7-year nightmare. If I closed my eyes for even a second, I was right back to that humid August night 7 years ago. It was the eve of Julian's departure for MIT to take over the massive tech patent trust fund left by his mother. We went to the island to celebrate, but then came the call from the Coast Guard, the sirens, the chaotic emergency room, the devastating news of severe brain damage supposedly caused by a faulty oxygen valve. I remembered pacing the sterile hospital hallways, the smell of antiseptic, and the crushing panic. Then Eleanor and the attending physician came out of the consultation room. Her face was a perfect mask of grief and composure. She walked straight into my arms, weeping quietly, and delivered the words that tore my life apart. "The damage is irreversible, Arthur. His nervous system is permanently ruined. He will never see or walk again." From that moment on, our entire world shifted. Eleanor instantly became the ultimate martyr. She took total control of every medical detail. With absolute devotion, she insisted that ordinary rehabilitation centers weren't good enough for our son. She used her connections to hire an exclusive, highly expensive private specialist, Dr. Silas Vance. He promised cutting-edge treatments that standard medicine couldn't offer. I believed her. I trusted her completely because she was my wife, and she played the role of the selflessly devoted stepmother flawlessly. She stepped away from high society and her art gallery. She stayed home every day, hovering over his medical bed like a protective hawk. And I did what a father and husband was supposed to do. I provided. I worked myself to the bone. When Dr. Vance's staggering monthly bills began draining our savings, I didn't hesitate. I liquidated my retirement, sold our properties overseas, and even stepped down as a partner at my firm. I willingly traded my life's work just to keep my son comfortable, believing I was giving him the best care in the country. Julian shifted on the cheap bedspread, pulling me back to the dim motel room. His breathing was still shallow, his muscles twitching from the intense exertion of our escape. 3 years ago, my left eye started sensing light, and my fingers began to tingle, he continued, his voice a mix of long-suppressed anger and deep sadness. At first, it was just a faint pins and needles sensation. I was so excited, Dad. I thought it was a real miracle. I told Eleanor immediately. And the next morning, when Dr. Vance came for his physical evaluation, I told him too. I stared at him, my forensic accountant's brain trying desperately to piece together the fragments of this horrifying puzzle. If you regained awareness 3 years ago, why were you still in that bed? Why didn't you ever tell me? Julian let out a bitter, hollow laugh. I tried to tell you. Do you remember that time I desperately tried to say my legs were burning, and you thought it was just phantom nerve pain? Every time you came to see me, Eleanor made sure to cut our conversation short. But the worst part was the medication. Every time I showed any real sign of improvement, whenever my vision cleared up slightly, or I could move my calves, Dr. Vance would schedule an emergency intervention. He would close the bedroom door, whisper with Eleanor in the hallway, and then they would come in with a brand new treatment routine. My stomach churned. A brand new treatment routine? Yes, Julian said, tears of frustration finally spilling over. Eleanor called it a custom nutrient blend. She said Dr. Vance had formulated a unique compound specifically to prevent painful muscle wasting. She insisted I needed it to stay alive. Every single night, she would walk in with a glass of warm water with 2 drops of a clear liquid in it, and she would watch me drink it. Less than 20 minutes later, the absolute nightmare would begin. He rubbed his face hard, trying to erase the horrific memories. "The medication wasn't helping me at all, Dad," Julian said, his voice trembling. "It was doing the exact opposite. Every time I drank that water, a heavy, overwhelming fog would take over my brain. I couldn't think, and I couldn't even put a coherent sentence together. I felt like I was floating in the deep ocean, completely disconnected from reality. But the absolute worst part was what it did to my body. Any strength I had managed to build up would vanish in an instant. My muscles would turn to absolute mush. When I woke up the next morning, I would be completely paralyzed and blind again, trapped inside a heavy, useless shell, dependent on her for my next breath. I listened in absolute horror and silence as a flood of memories rushed back to me. I remembered coming home after 14 hours of grueling audit work, walking into his medical room, and finding him staring blankly at the ceiling. Eleanor would tenderly wipe his face with a warm towel, look at me with tearful eyes, and whisper about how his condition was worsening. She told me it was just the natural progression of his severe neurological trauma. She told me I needed to work harder and bring in more money so Dr. Vance could find a better solution. She had been lying to my face every single day. She had looked me dead in the eye, weaponizing my love for my son to fund a horrifying, meticulously calculated deception. They kept adjusting the dosage, Julian continued, his voice growing louder, fueled by a righteous anger. Whenever my mind started to clear, whenever I started asking questions or showing resistance because my vision was returning, the medication would mysteriously increase. I was a prisoner, Dad. My stepmother was my cruel warden, and Dr. Vance was her loyal executioner. They were intentionally destroying my central nervous system, keeping me trapped in that bed forever. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost too massive to fully comprehend. She had drained my life savings to pay a corrupt doctor to actively poison my son. "Why?" I asked quietly, my voice sounding incredibly old and fragile in the quiet room. "Why would she do this to you?" Julian didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly rolled up the sleeve of his shirt, exposing his pale forearm. Perfectly hidden beneath the fabric were dozens of dark red needle marks. They weren't treating me, they were poisoning me. I stared at the bruised punctures on my son's arm. That dense cluster of marks was a brutal map of 7 years of systematic abuse. My stomach churned with a sickening mix of deep guilt and absolute rage. For 7 years, I had dutifully paid astronomical medical bills, blindly trusting the woman I brought into my home. I had abandoned my role as a protective father, because she made me believe my only necessary role was that of a financial provider. With a trembling hand, I carefully pulled Julian's soft cotton sleeve back down, covering the horrifying physical evidence of his long captivity. The overwhelming emotional shock tried to paralyze my logical mind, but I refused to let it. I used to be a top forensic accountant. I had dedicated my entire career to understanding how immense financial pressure affects complex corporate structures, sharply identifying the fatal financial cracks before a massive business empire completely collapsed. Now my own family was rapidly imploding, and its foundation was built entirely on deliberate, malicious lies. I rubbed my face hard with both hands, taking a deep, stabilizing breath to calm my racing heart. I needed to shift my active mind from a grieving father to a cold, calculating forensic investigator. I stood up from the sagging motel bed and walked over to a scratched laminate desk in the dim corner. Unzipping my worn leather briefcase, I pulled out my encrypted silver laptop. I lifted the screen, and the bright digital glow illuminated the dusty walls of our temporary hideout. Julian sat on the edge of the bed, watching me silently. His rapid breathing was finally beginning to level out after the immense physical exertion of our escape. Eleanor thought she had completely cornered me by revoking my digital access to our primary checking and savings accounts. She mistakenly believed that cutting off my immediate cash flow would leave me panicked and helpless, forcing me into total submission to her sinister demands. But she had severely underestimated the incredibly meticulous nature of my personal financial planning. During my most lucrative years running the audit firm, I had quietly established several secondary offshore accounts and an incredibly secure private corporate trust that she knew absolutely nothing about. These hidden accounts routed through completely independent financial institutions and were protected by complex multi-factor authentication protocols. My stiff fingers flew across the glowing keyboard, flawlessly entering the complex passphrases and long security keys I had memorized perfectly decades ago. Within 3 suffocating minutes, I successfully bypassed her digital blockade. I now had full, unrestricted master ledger, access to all our shared credit lines and historical banking data. I immediately pulled up the real-time transaction history for the premium platinum credit card Eleanor always kept safely tucked inside her designer handbag. She had explicitly told me she was heading to Sedona, Arizona, for a deeply relaxing mindfulness weekend. Naturally, I expected to see charges at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport or a deposit for a Sedona resort. Instead, the glowing digital ledger painted a completely different and deeply disturbing picture of her actual movements. Her credit card hadn't been swiped anywhere in the sunny Southwest today. Exactly 30 minutes after she kissed my cheek and cheerfully drove away from our suburban estate, a massive pre-authorization charge had processed at a 5-star luxury hotel in downtown Boston. She hadn't even left the city limits. I kept scrolling down the bright screen, my jaw tightening with every line of transaction data that appeared. Following the massive hotel deposit was a string of heavy purchases at high-end fashion boutiques along Boston's famous Newbury Street. In a matter of just 4 hours, she had casually spent $12,000 at a luxury jewelry store and another $8,000 at an exclusive designer clothing shop. She wasn't at a wellness retreat at all. She was celebrating. She was actively spending my hard-earned money on an incredibly lavish shopping spree while setting the final legal stage to have me permanently committed to a cold institution. I stared blankly at the glowing screen, letting the massive scale of her brilliant deception settle completely into my exhausted mind. The terrible truth acted like a harsh spotlight, suddenly illuminating the dark, deeply suspicious corners of the past 7 years. I began to actively retrace the steps of this entire decade with a new, absolutely chilling clarity. I thought back specifically to the chaotic initial days following Julian's tragic diving accident. Using my considerable financial resources, I had aggressively hired the absolute best private rehabilitation nurses money could buy. I had desperately wanted a dedicated team of trained medical professionals stationed at the house to ensure his maximum comfort and highest potential for physical recovery. But Eleanor had ruthlessly fired them, one by one. She loudly accused the first nurse of gross negligence. She angrily claimed the second nurse had stolen expensive items from her personal jewelry box, and she very convincingly argued that the third nurse made Julian feel deeply uncomfortable in his own bedroom. Within a single year, she had completely severed his connection to the outside medical community, flawlessly ensuring that she was the only person monitoring his daily life. And she had methodically isolated me, too. Whenever I tried to read his detailed medical charts or strongly suggested sitting in on his private sessions with Dr. Vance, she would gently place a soft hand on my chest and shake her head sadly. "You're getting older, Arthur," she would whisper in that deeply patronizing tone she had perfected over the years. "Managing the firm's assets is already keeping your blood pressure too high. You provide the critical financial support, and I will gladly manage the medical stress. Leave the heavy lifting to me." It was pure genius. It was a terrifyingly brilliant masterclass in targeted psychological manipulation. She had successfully weaponized my advancing age, my high-stress professional responsibilities, and my deep, unconditional love for my family to systematically blindfold me. I leaned closer to the bright laptop screen, my tired eyes narrowing sharply as I began a deep, comprehensive dive into the archived transaction histories of the past 36 months. I was desperately hunting for the exact financial footprint of her wicked partnership with Dr. Vance. I bypassed the routine household expenses, the regular utility bills, and the expensive weekly grocery deliveries. Then I finally saw it. It was buried deep within automated monthly bank transfers disguised as routine corporate property investments. On the 15th of every single month for the past 5 years, exactly $25,000 had been quietly funneled from our joint investment portfolio directly into a private LLC holding company. I slowly highlighted the small string of digital text, my racing heart turning completely to ice as I read the name of the registered entity aloud in the quiet motel room. V&E Allied Health Properties, Vance and Eleanor. The name of the holding company echoed in my mind like a death knell. I closed the laptop gently, moving with absolute care so as not to disturb Julian. He had finally drifted into a deep sleep on the adjacent bed, his chest rising and falling with a peaceful rhythm I hadn't seen in 7 long years. I pulled a spare blanket over his shoulders, made sure the deadbolt was firmly locked from the inside, and stepped out into the freezing night air. I needed a secure public network. I drove that old Land Rover down the dark, deserted highway until the flickering neon light of a 24-hour diner pierced the darkness. I pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling as I walked inside. Sliding into a sticky vinyl booth in the furthest corner, I ordered a cup of black coffee that I had absolutely no intention of drinking. I opened my laptop, connected to the unencrypted public Wi-Fi, and carefully blocked the screen with my body to shield it from the tired waitress wiping down the counter. My background in forensic accounting had taught me how to trace cracks in corporate asset structures down to the micrometer. Investigating financial fraud is exactly the same discipline. You just have to follow the stress fractures until you find the broken, load-bearing beam. I started with the man who had been giving my son poison every single night. I typed Dr. Silas Vance into the State Medical Board's database. The initial search results showed a perfectly curated professional profile, filled with glowing compliments and prestigious affiliations. But I knew exactly how to dig deeper. I ran his credential number through the Federal Medicare Fraud Registry and cross-referenced his past addresses. That was when the flawless facade began to crumble. 6 years before Eleanor brought him into our home, Vance's medical license had been quietly revoked in Florida. The official disciplinary records were buried under layers of obscure legal jargon, but the core offense was clear. He had been investigated for gross medical malpractice, specifically heavily overprescribing powerful sedatives and highly experimental chemical compounds to vulnerable patients. He had only escaped a federal prison sentence by voluntarily surrendering his state license and quietly moving away. Eleanor hadn't found a miracle worker. She had intentionally sought out a disgraced, desperate man with a dark history of medical abuse. I pulled up the public property tax records for the greater Boston area and searched for the holding company I had just found on my wife's shared credit card statement, V&E Allied Health Properties. The search results loaded instantly, and my jaw clamped together so hard that my back teeth ached. This disgraced, completely unlicensed doctor currently owned 3 ultra-luxury penthouses in Boston's most affluent downtown neighborhoods. Their total market value conservatively exceeded $12 million. A private rehab doctor caring for a single paralyzed patient could never legitimately afford such a massive real estate portfolio. He wasn't earning a regular salary. He had been getting a massive cut from a much larger, highly coordinated criminal enterprise. 但最初那笔庞大的资本究竟是从哪里来的? My personal assets were substantial, but I strictly controlled the outflow of my cash. They had to be getting tens of millions from somewhere else. A devastating realization suddenly hit me like a freight train traveling at full speed. The tech patent trust left behind by my first wife. 7 years ago, before Julian's biological mother passed away from a sudden heart attack, she legally established a massive, irrevocable trust fund exclusively for her beloved son. This private trust was initially funded with $15 million, explicitly designated by law, to cover Julian's future living expenses, education, and potential business startup capital. In the event of a major illness, the money was to be used for top-tier medical care. Because I was so consumed by my heavy schedule auditing multinational corporate mergers, At the time, combined with my total trust in Eleanor, I had willingly signed over the primary administrative control of that trust to her. She was the legally designated caregiver. As long as the ongoing expenses were strictly categorized as necessary medical treatment, she had absolute unrestricted authority over how those massive funds were dispersed. Using a secret administrative bypass code I had carefully written into those thick legal documents years ago, I securely logged into the private wealth management portal. I quickly navigated straight into the master trust ledger. My trembling hands hovered above the glowing keyboard, hesitating. Taking a deep breath, I hit enter. The screen instantly loaded 7 long years of incredibly detailed financial history. I stared blankly at the numbers, a deep, sickening wave of nausea washing over my entire body. It was an absolute financial massacre. Millions upon millions of dollars had been methodically and ruthlessly drained, month after month, year after year. Every single outgoing wire transfer had been personally authorized by Eleanor and paid directly to various obscure shell companies owned entirely by Dr. Vance. The expense categories were incredibly creative and entirely fictional. Advanced experimental neuronal stimulation therapy, cutting-edge spinal cord stem cell, regeneration protocol, premium custom mobility equipment procurement. It was a highly complex, perfectly documented paper trail of absolute lies. Every single penny meant to provide a better, more comfortable life for my son had been actively used to pay a corrupt, evil monster to chemically paralyze him in a medical bed. They were actually billing the massive trust fund to continuously and systematically poison its sole beneficiary. I scrolled frantically to the very bottom of the complex ledger to check the current available balance. The glowing red numbers confirmed my absolute worst fear. The massive safety net meant to guarantee my son's future was completely gone. There was less than $40,000 left in the account. Eleanor and Vance had coldly drained the first family fortune, but the final, most chilling piece of the puzzle was still missing. If the trust fund was entirely exhausted, why was Eleanor taking such a massive, incredibly dangerous legal risk right now? Why was she spending this Monday morning orchestrating a complex legal conspiracy to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away in an asylum? I looked at the date on the screen and calculated the total value of the remaining assets under my own name. My private portfolio, my commercial real estate holdings, and the equity in our marital home currently totaled roughly $20 million. More importantly, I held the absolute controlling voting rights for my late wife's tech company, which was scheduled to be acquired by a giant corporation next month. As long as I was legally classified as sound of mind, she couldn't touch a single dime of that massive fortune. My vast estate was heavily protected by legal safeguards, and any large-scale liquidation required my direct, physical signature. Suddenly I understood the true, terrifying scope of her urgent timeline. She had completely emptied Julian's trust fund. The golden goose was dead. Her lavish lifestyle, her expensive downtown luxury hotel stays, her designer shopping sprees, and Vance's massive luxury real estate empire were suddenly completely out of money. She desperately needed a brand new, massive source of funding, and she needed it right now. I was the next target. The bone-chilling scale of this sociopathic greed finally sank deep into my tired bones. My first instinct was to grab my phone, call the local police, and scream the horrifying truth to anyone who would listen. But my highly trained analytical mind quickly and forcefully overrode that dangerous emotional impulse. If I were to walk into a bustling police precinct at 65 years old, frantically raving about a 7-year conspiracy involving a highly respected medical specialist, intentional physical paralysis, and a massive hidden real estate empire, I would sound exactly like a crazy old man losing his mind. I would walk directly into her manicured hands. She already had completely falsified medical evaluations declaring me legally insane. She was actively and meticulously building an airtight legal case to completely seize my remaining estate through forced legal guardianship. A hysterical, unverified police report would simply be the final nail in my coffin. I desperately needed hard, irrefutable physical evidence. I needed the actual physical poison she used to keep my only son compliant. I turned my head slowly toward the other side of the dim room. Julian was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in the quiet shadows of the cheap motel. I quietly wrote a long list of strict, specific instructions on a thin sheet of motel stationery, leaving it right next to a cheap, prepaid burner phone I had bought at a desolate gas station. Locking the heavy metal deadbolt firmly from the outside, I stepped out into the freezing Boston night. I drove the creaking old Land Rover back toward our affluent, spotless suburb, my mind entirely focused on the critical task ahead. At 2 a.m, the winding residential streets were completely deserted, bathed softly in the artificial yellowish light of the tall street lamps. I parked the heavy SUV exactly 3 blocks away from my massive estate, wanting to avoid triggering the motion-activated security cameras installed above the wide driveway. Moving like a desperate thief in the night, I walked quietly and carefully across the damp, freezing grass of my neighbors' manicured lawns to approach my own mansion. The towering custom brick structure looked incredibly dark and imposing in the shadows. I expertly bypassed the main exterior alarm system. I had designed the entire complex security network myself 5 years ago, which meant I knew exactly how to temporarily blind the exterior laser sensors without accidentally sending a silent panic signal to the private security company. I slipped through the heavy glass patio doors without a sound, stepping into the empty, absolutely dead silent kitchen. The massive house felt incredibly cold, distinctly hostile, and completely empty. Relying entirely on deep muscle memory, I navigated through the dark, familiar hallways. I knew exactly which expensive oak floorboards would creak and which ones were structurally silent. I moved forward at an agonizingly slow pace, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, until I finally stood before the heavy, solid mahogany door of Eleanor's private art studio. She always kept it locked tight. I pulled a thin steel tension wrench and a small, delicate pick from my heavy jacket pocket, tools I used to use for precisely calibrating high-security corporate safes during audits. Within 40 suffocating seconds, the heavy brass lock let out a solid, incredibly satisfying click. I slipped into the dark room, closing the heavy wooden door tightly behind me, and clicked on my small, bright, tactical flashlight. The highly focused beam swept across her spotless, perfectly organized glass desk. My intuition told me that she had hidden the high-potency medication in this exact room. Methodically and silently, I checked every wooden drawer, every locked filing cabinet, and every decorative wooden box on the wide shelves. Nothing. I stood dead center in the dark room, thinking exactly like an experienced forensic accountant. I studied the main walls, looking desperately for any structural anomalies or hidden spaces. My tired eyes quickly landed on a massive, heavy oil painting hanging right in the middle of the far wall. Carefully, I lifted the heavy, ornate wooden frame completely off its thick brass hooks and set it gently down on the soft carpet. A sleek, flush-mounted steel wall safe stared silently back at me. It was a modern safe equipped with a biometric scanner and an electronic keypad. But I wasn't just an accountant. I knew her psychology. She was an incredibly vain, predictable woman. I quickly pulled a micro-thermal camera attachment from my pocket and connected it to my phone, a device I normally use to detect overheating in corporate servers. I aimed the lens at the keypad. The screen clearly revealed faint heat signatures left behind on 4 specific keys. She had definitely opened this right before leaving the house. Cross-referencing her birth year and our anniversary, I eliminated 2 combinations. On my 3rd attempt, the indicator light turned green, and with a soft, mechanical sigh, the heavy steel door popped open. I shone the flashlight beam straight into the dark interior. Sitting neatly inside were 4 unmarked glass vials filled with a clear, colorless liquid. The original manufacturer labels had been completely torn off. Right next to them was a thick manila folder. Suddenly the loud, unmistakable sound of the heavy front door unlocking echoed through the dead, silent house. My heart hammered a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. The front door slammed shut, and heavy, hurried footsteps immediately started walking across the imported hardwood floor of the main foyer. Those weren't the light, rhythmic clicks of Eleanor's designer heels. These footsteps were heavy, urgent, and distinctly male. I had only seconds to react before he entered the room. I lunged forward, grabbing the 4 glass vials from the open safe and shoving them deep into the inner pockets of my heavy winter coat. I swept my hand across the shelf and grabbed the manila folder containing the falsified psychological evaluations. I needed a place to hide, and this spacious studio offered very few options for a man of my size. My eyes darted to the slatted closet doors built into the darkest corner of the room. I sprinted across the soft Persian rug and threw my body into the cramped, suffocating darkness of the small closet, just as the brass handle of the studio door began to slowly turn. I pulled the slatted door shut, leaving a fraction of a millimeter open so I could watch the room. I held my breath completely, pressing my back flat against the cold drywall. The heavy studio door was pushed open with aggressive force. The bright, sterile overhead lights flickered on, piercing through the narrow wooden slats and stinging my sensitive eyes. As my vision quickly adjusted to the sudden glare, I instantly recognized the late-night intruder. It wasn't my treacherous wife. It was Dr. Silas Vance. He looked absolutely nothing like the well-dressed, arrogant medical professional who always slid into our quiet home carrying an expensive leather medical bag. Tonight, his expensive custom suit jacket was heavily wrinkled and stained. His silk tie was pulled loose around his thick neck, and a heavy visible sweat covered his pale forehead. He was breathing heavily, his dark eyes scanning the perfectly organized office space with pure, desperate panic. He marched straight toward the massive glass desk, completely missing the open wall, safe in his blind frenzy. He immediately began ripping through the neat stacks of household documents, violently tossing expensive stationery and heavy leather financial ledgers straight onto the floor. I watched his every erratic movement from my dark sanctuary, counting his breath. He was desperately searching for the exact folder I was currently holding tightly against my chest. He cursed out loud, a vicious sound that completely shattered the quiet dignity of my home. He slammed his fist hard onto the glass desktop, pacing back and forth like a trapped, terrified animal. After a long, frantic, and completely futile search, he shoved his hand into his trousers, pulled out his phone, and aggressively tapped the glowing screen. He hit the speakerphone button and rudely tossed the sleek device onto the cluttered desk. The loud, rhythmic ringing filled the tense air of the room. Eleanor answered on the second ring. Her familiar voice sounded sharp and deeply irritated, completely stripped of her usual soothing charm. "Silas, what on earth is taking so long?" she demanded impatiently. "Did you finally get those specific documents off the desk?" Dr. Vance leaned heavily over the glowing phone, visibly angry. His pale face was a mask of pure anxiety. "I'm looking for them right now, Eleanor. The critical files are absolutely not where you said they would be. I need those falsified psychological evaluations in my hands tonight. You assured me they were completely finished and sitting right in the center of the glass desk." Eleanor let out a loud, heavy sigh through the small digital speaker. "They are right there, Silas. Don't be completely hysterical. Stop panicking like a child and look for them. I placed them perfectly right next to the desk lamp. We absolutely cannot afford any stupid mistakes at this critical stage." "I am not panicking," Vance hissed viciously, violently sweeping a thick stack of envelopes onto the floor. "I'm trying to make sure our massive investment is secured. If I don't have these specific legal documents safely in my briefcase tomorrow morning, our entire timeline is completely ruined. We need to officially file them with the court immediately. By Monday noon, the judge will grant full medical guardianship. Once that gavel falls, Arthur is legally erased. The local police will drag him straight to a secured facility, and we will finally have full, undisputed authority over his remaining $15 million. My blood ran absolutely cold. Hearing this evil, calculated plan spoken aloud inside my own home was a deeply chilling violation. They were discussing my total, absolute destruction in the same casual, ordinary tone people use to talk about a weekly grocery list. I tightened my grip on the thick manila folder, the absolute physical proof of their upcoming crime, held safe with me in the shadows. I closed my tired eyes for a second, silently calming my breathing. But this sickening conversation was far from over. Eleanor's voice suddenly turned incredibly cold, completely stripped of any human empathy and deeply clinical. Once Arthur is permanently locked away, we must immediately and systematically handle the boy, she said firmly. Julian has been moving around far too much lately. He complained to me this morning about a burning sensation in his legs. He is rapidly building a physical tolerance to the current chemical blend. Vance groaned loudly, running a trembling hand through his thinning dark hair. I know, Eleanor. During the last evaluation, I noticed his severe muscle spasms. The nerve blocks are definitely beginning to fail completely. Once his meddling father is out of the picture, we can finally increase the dose. We'll double the chemical compound in his nightly drops. Within 48 hours, it will completely burn out his motor functions. He'll become entirely compliant, and we will never have to worry about him trying to stand up again. Good, Eleanor said. Grab the files and get out of that house completely. Come meet me back at the hotel suite. Vance abruptly hung up the phone. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes scanning the quiet room. Then his piercing gaze landed directly on the slatted mahogany closet doors. My tightening heart completely stopped beating. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. I quietly reached out in the absolute darkness, my fingers wrapping tightly around a heavy bronze paperweight, ready to strike. The brass handle of the slatted door let out a loud rattle as Vance gripped it with his sweaty palm. My knuckles turned completely white around the solid metal. My muscles braced like a tightly coiled spring, preparing for a violent, desperate physical struggle. I held my breath, pushing myself completely into the suffocating darkness of the closet, ready to drive the solid metal straight into his skull, the absolute second the door swung open. Just as the hinges began to creak, a sharp, piercing ring shattered the incredibly tense silence. Vance flinched violently, ripping his hand away from the door handle. He lunged across the carpet, frantically grabbing his glowing phone from the cluttered glass desk. It was Eleanor calling back. Her voice came through the small speaker as a sharp, frantic shriek. "Get out of there right now!" she screamed. The security company just called to report a brief voltage fluctuation on the main exterior sensors. If Arthur tripped the alarm, the local police are already on their way. Just grab whatever medical files you can find and leave immediately. Vance panicked completely. He shoved the phone into his jacket, entirely abandoning his search for the specific falsified document I was currently holding tightly against my chest. He frantically scooped up a random stack of worthless utility bills from the floor, jammed them clumsily into his expensive leather briefcase, and ran out of the office. I listened to his heavy footsteps echoing down the long hallway. A few seconds later, the massive front door slammed shut with a dull thud, followed by the harsh squeal of expensive tires tearing out of our driveway. I let out a broken, ragged breath, my entire body shaking violently from the massive rush of adrenaline. I waited in the absolute darkness of the closet for 3 excruciating minutes to make sure the house was truly empty. I pushed the slatted door open and stepped cautiously back into the bright office. I securely tucked the thick manila folder of falsified psychological evaluations and the 4 unmarked glass vials into the inner lining of my heavy winter coat. Moving like a ghost through the silent house, I slipped out the back patio doors and vanished perfectly into the freezing shadows of the sleeping neighborhood. When I made it back to my old Land Rover, I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the heavy doors. I didn't drive straight back to the rundown motel. I had an incredibly urgent destination in mind. My analytical mind was running at maximum capacity. I needed irrefutable scientific proof of exactly what chemical poison they were forcing my son to swallow every night. I sped down the empty highway, heading straight toward an exclusive, highly discreet, 24-hour private testing laboratory on the industrial edge of the city. The facility was secretly owned by Dr. Emily Chen, a brilliant independent toxicologist and a highly trusted old friend of mine. Years ago, I had personally helped her untangle a highly complex tax issue involving her laboratory equipment procurement. I knew she was a night owl who preferred doing her intricate analysis in the absolute quiet of the early morning hours. I parked in the desolate lot and slammed my heavy fist directly against the reinforced steel security door. After a long minute, Emily opened the door. She was wearing a stained lab coat, her thick glasses pushed high up on her wrinkled forehead. "Arthur?" she asked, her tired eyes widening in pure surprise. "My God, what on earth are you doing here at this hour?" I pushed past her into the bright, clinical lab. "Emily, I don't have time for small talk. I need your expertise, and I need this completely off the official record." I reached deep into my heavy jacket and placed the 4 unmarked glass vials directly onto her stainless steel examination table. Emily stared at the mysterious clear liquids. Her professional curiosity instantly piqued. "What exactly is this, Arthur?" I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills, straight from my worn leather briefcase, exactly $5,000 in cash that I had specifically withdrawn during my initial escape. I pushed the heavy stack across the cold metal table. "I don't know what they are, Emily, but I suspect they are highly toxic, unregulated neurotoxins. I need a comprehensive, expedited chemical analysis. I need to know the exact chemical compounds inside these specific vials, and I must have the detailed toxicology report in my hands within the next 24 hours. Don't ask any legal questions." Emily looked down at the money, then looked directly into my desperate, burning eyes. She nodded slowly, sliding the unmarked vials and the cash toward her side of the table. "I'll spin up the mass spectrometer right now, Arthur. You'll have your exact answers by morning." I thanked her quickly and stepped back out into the freezing Boston wind. I checked the glowing digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 5 a.m. The pitch-black sky was just beginning to turn a bruised, deep purple. Before returning to my terrified son, I had one final critical stop to make. I threw the heavy truck into gear and drove aggressively toward a highly exclusive, gated community on the North Shore. I was heading directly to the private residence of David Hatcher. David wasn't just a trusted personal friend. He was a veteran former FBI agent from the Financial Crimes Division who now ran a highly ruthless, fiercely loyal, private security and investigative firm. For over 20 years, he had assisted me in tearing down malicious corporate frauds. He was the only man I absolutely trusted to navigate the upcoming legal war. I parked the creaking truck in his pristine driveway and marched straight up the wide stone steps. I pounded violently against the heavy oak front door with my right fist, completely unconcerned about waking up his wealthy, sleeping neighborhood. I beat against the solid wood until my knuckles throbbed with a dull ache. After an agonizing 3 minutes, the heavy door finally swung open. David stood there in a silk bathrobe, his graying hair completely disheveled, his face flushed with the righteous anger of sleep deprivation. "Arthur, have you lost your mind?" he hissed angrily, tightening the belt of his robe. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I pushed past his bulky frame, walking straight into his grand marble foyer. "David, we don't have time to sleep," I said firmly, walking with absolute purpose directly into his formal dining room. I violently dumped the contents of my heavy leather briefcase across the polished mahogany dining table. The falsified psychological evaluations and the detailed financial spreadsheets documenting the completely drained $15 million trust fund scattered perfectly under the bright overhead light. David approached the long table, his sharp investigator's mind instantly recognizing the devastating implications of the heavy documents. "What exactly am I looking at, Arthur?" he whispered, completely stunned. I looked the old agent dead in the eye. "David, within 48 hours, my wife is going to legally strip away my mind, my freedom, and finish off my son. We are going to war." David froze in the marble foyer, his sleep-deprived eyes locking onto the chaotic piles of documents scattered across the mahogany table. He reached out slowly, picking up the falsified psychological evaluation bearing Dr. Silas Vance's signature. I watched his sharp, predatory investigative mind instantly shift from sheer confusion to a cold, calculating rage. He set the evaluation down gently and picked up the financial ledger, detailing the total exhaustion of the $15 million trust fund. David finally looked up at me, the color completely drained from his usually vibrant face. "Arthur, this is a perfectly constructed legal guillotine," he murmured, his voice a mix of professional awe and deep personal disgust. "She has flawlessly documented a completely fabricated narrative of severe dementia and escalating paranoia. If Eleanor walks into probate court this Monday morning and manages to file this specific petition first, you are legally dead." He began to pace across the polished floor, his bare feet making a soft slapping sound against the cold marble. The brutal reality of current medical guardianship laws is incredibly unforgiving. Arthur, once a judge officially signs off on an emergency medical order, you instantly lose absolutely every basic human right. You aren't allowed to hire your own attorney. You aren't allowed to access your own bank accounts. And you can't even legally protest being forced into an institution. The local police will show up at your front door, put you in heavy restraints, and transport you directly to a locked psychiatric ward. And the absolute worst part is that she will instantly gain full, unrestricted legal control over your entire $20 million estate, including those priceless patent holdings and the ultimate medical power of attorney over Julian. We have less than 48 hours before the county clerk opens. We absolutely cannot afford to play defense. If we wait for her to file that petition, we will be trapped in a suffocating years-long legal nightmare, and Julian will never survive that timeline. I stood perfectly still, letting his chilling legal assessment wash over me. "What cards do we have left to play, David?" I asked. My voice remained incredibly steady, even as a storm of pure panic brewed deep inside my chest. David stopped pacing and slammed his hands heavily onto the thick desk. "We are going to ambush her," he declared, his eyes burning with absolute determination. "We are going to dismantle her entire operation before she ever takes a single step onto those courthouse stairs on Monday morning." He immediately marched into his adjacent home office, completely ignoring the fact that he was still in his silk bathrobe, and booted up his massive desktop computer. "I'm drafting a massive stack of emergency counter-injunctions right now," he shouted over the loud hum of the machine. "The moment a duty judge is available, I'll personally file an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order against Eleanor and Dr. Vance. But we need heavy, direct firepower to ensure they get arrested on the spot." He grabbed his phone from its charging dock and quickly dialed a highly specific, unlisted number. "I'm calling in a long overdue favor with Director Miller at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division," he explained quickly as the phone rang loudly. "He's a high-level, utterly ruthless investigator who absolutely despises medical fraud involving massive interstate funds." David concisely outlined the massive embezzlement scheme to the sleeping FBI director, detailing the $15 million theft and the hidden luxury real estate portfolio owned by Vance. Half an hour later, when he hung up the phone, the trap was perfectly set. Director Miller was quietly mobilizing a highly discreet federal task force to freeze their hidden accounts and prepare immediate felony arrest warrants for grand financial fraud and suspected attempted medical murder. We were going to hit them with the absolute hammer of the law. I left David furiously typing legal petitions in his dark office and drove the creaking truck through the waking city. The early morning sun was just beginning to break through the cold horizon, casting long, pale rays of light across the deserted industrial streets. I parked in the rundown motel lot, my heart aching with a desperate need to see my son. I quickly unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pushed open the creaking door. Julian was sitting upright on the edge of the sagging mattress, gripping the cheap bedsheets with white knuckles, staring directly at the entrance in pure terror. He was incredibly pale, drenched in cold sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Dad," he gasped, his voice breaking with sheer fear. "I thought she found us. I thought you weren't coming back." I rushed across the small, dim room and pulled my grown son into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face into my heavy winter coat, his shoulders shaking violently from years of suppressed trauma and the panic of the moment. I wrapped my arms tightly around his trembling frame, resting my chin gently on top of his head. For the first time in 7 long, agonizing years, I let a hot tear slide down my weathered cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief. It was a tear of absolute, unyielding resolve. "I'm right here, Julian," I whispered fiercely into the quiet, dusty room, holding him closer against my chest. "I'm never leaving you alone with them again. You are completely safe now." I pulled back slightly, looking straight into his terrified, exhausted eyes. "You walked yesterday, son," I said, my voice carrying deep fatherly pride and absolute certainty. "You survived 7 years of chemical torture, and you didn't just live through it. Nijanchi Lila. Tomorrow, you are going to stand tall and watch them completely burn to the ground." Julian looked at me, a tiny, fragile spark of real hope finally cutting through the heavy, suffocating fear in his tired eyes. He nodded slowly, and his breathing finally began to level out in the quiet safety of the hidden room. I reached into my pocket to pull out the prepaid burner phone I had left for him, intending to check for any updates from David. Before my fingers could touch the smooth plastic casing, my personal phone vibrated violently against my hip. The sharp, unexpected noise made us both flinch instinctively. I quickly pulled the device out, my eyes narrowing at the glowing screen. It was Dr. Emily Chen calling from the private chemical lab. I answered immediately, my chest tightening with intense anticipation. "Emily, what did you find?" I asked, lowering my voice to a sharp, hurried whisper. There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the secure line. When Emily finally spoke, her usually calm, analytical voice was shaking with absolute, undeniable horror. "Arthur," she stammered, breathing heavily into the receiver, "I ran those chemical compounds through the mass spectrometer 3 times just to be absolutely sure. This isn't human medication, Arthur. The primary active ingredient is a heavily restricted, high-potency synthetic muscle relaxant mixed with a thallium-based neuroinhibitor compound. This combination is exclusively used in large veterinary practices. It's a powerful neuromuscular blocker, meant for heavily sedating and ultimately euthanizing large livestock. Where on earth did you get this stuff?" I stood perfectly still in the rundown motel hallway, the phone pressed tight against my ear. Emily's terrified voice echoed loudly through the speaker, shattering the last remaining piece of my reality. It wasn't a human medical experiment. It was a potent synthetic chemical designed to slowly paralyze heavy agricultural livestock. Emily explained with intense professional disgust that repeated, long-term exposure to this specific compound would systematically and severely wither human muscle tissue, inducing deep paralysis, reversible optic nerve damage, and a devastating neurological fog. Eleanor, the woman I had trusted with my entire life, had been actively poisoning our only flesh and blood. For 7 long years, she had methodically forced our son to swallow heavy animal sedatives and chronic poison every single night. I thanked Emily in an empty whisper and hung up the phone. The sheer evil of her actions felt like a suffocating weight crushing my chest. I took Julian back to David Hatcher's safe house. There, David's lead private investigator, Marcus, was sitting quietly at the desk. Marcus had been actively feeding Eleanor's financial history into a restricted digital database, hunting for any offshore accounts or hidden property deeds tied to Vance. We sat in a tense, heavy silence as the morning sun rose higher into the sky. Close to noon, Marcus suddenly stopped typing. He slowly pushed his heavy, gold-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and let out a long, sharp breath. "Arthur," he said softly, his voice carrying a dark, ominous tone that sent a fresh jolt of cold blood straight into my veins. "I found something buried deep within the archived banking records you pulled from the wall. Safe. It's not just another luxury real estate purchase, and it's not another hidden offshore wire to a corrupt doctor." Marcus turned his silver laptop around so David and the rest of us could see the glowing screen clearly. He pointed directly to a specific, highly encrypted wire transfer originating from Eleanor's personal checking account. The digital timestamp on the official banking document was incredibly specific. The massive payment of $100,000 cash had been permanently processed exactly 7 years ago. I leaned closer to the bright screen, my tired eyes tracing the cold black text. The exact date of this massive financial transfer was a Tuesday in late August. It was exactly 48 hours before Julian was scheduled to excitedly pack his bags for MIT and officially begin taking control of his trust fund. It was exactly 2 days before his catastrophic diving accident that stripped his brain of oxygen and supposedly ruined his bright future. "Who exactly received this money?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural rasp. Marcus pulled up the routing numbers and the corresponding business licenses. The recipient was a highly suspicious local independent dive shop owner on Martha's Vineyard. Less than a week after Julian's tragic accident, he abruptly closed down his shop and moved completely out of the state. The horrifying, monstrous truth finally came together perfectly, illuminating the absolute darkest corner of my wife's soul. That terrible diving accident was never a tragic mishap. It was a meticulously calculated, premeditated hit. She had engineered the total ruin of his future. Eleanor had deliberately paid a desperate contact to sabotage the vital equipment for my son's deep dive. She had actively tried to permanently break or completely silence her own stepson, all to ensure that he would never, ever leave her house. If Julian successfully entered MIT and took legal control of that tech company, she would completely lose her status as his primary legal guardian. She would lose her direct, unchecked access to the $15 million medical trust fund his biological mother had so generously established. Her entire horrifying motive was rooted in pure sociopathic greed. She had engineered the sabotage that robbed her son of oxygen, destroyed his nerves, and then spent 7 long years actively feeding him livestock sedatives, perfectly ensuring her absolute control over a massive fortune. My analytical forensic brain snapped, shifting from immense grief to a cold, calculating state of absolute fury. I was no longer just a betrayed husband, and I was no longer just a heartbroken father. I became a hyper-focused, highly motivated predator, swearing to completely dismantle the monsters who had tortured my family. I turned to David, my hands balled into trembling fists. "We can't just arrest them, David. We have to erase their entire existence." David nodded slowly, a predatory, ruthless smile spreading across his weathered face. He immediately began coordinating directly with FBI Director Miller and his elite task force, perfectly laying the legal and tactical foundations for the ultimate, inescapable trap. Julian sat on the safe house bed watching me. I told him everything, the horrific truth about the animal sedatives, the completely drained trust fund, and the terrifying discovery about his compromised oxygen tank. I watched the last remnants of his childhood innocence vanish, instantly replaced by a deep, hardening resolve. I pulled him into a tight, protective embrace. "You took the first brave step yesterday, son," I told him, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a solemn promise. "Tonight, you're going to stand perfectly straight, and you're going to watch them burn to ash." We spent the rest of the weekend in absolute secrecy. We didn't set our trap at the old house in Brookline, because this weekend Eleanor had meticulously planned the grand finale of her twisted performance. Sunday evening finally arrived, casting long, dark shadows over a cold, sprawling downtown Boston. Tonight, Eleanor was hosting a massive charity gala for rare neurological illness research in the ballroom of an ultra-luxury hotel in the Boston Seaport District. She had invited the absolute top tier of Boston high society, media, and legal circles. She intended to use the climax of the evening to tearfully announce that I had lost my mind due to grief, officially launching her petition for full legal guardianship alongside Dr. Vance. I sat quietly in a black communications van arranged by David, staring at my glowing phone screen. The time slowly ticked to 7 p.m. David turned around and nodded at me. The task force was in position. Every exit of the hotel was blocked by FBI agents. "Let's go," I said. Julian and I stepped out of the vehicle. Julian stood perfectly straight, completely free of the rusted wheelchair that had imprisoned him for 7 years. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored Armani suit I had bought for him just yesterday, his broad shoulders squared and his chin held high. The physical transformation was nothing short of a miracle. Without the heavy veterinary sedatives flowing through his central nervous system, his natural youth and inner strength had rapidly surged back. The thick, foggy veil had completely cleared from his bright eyes, replaced by a sharp, burning intensity. We walked through the hotel corridors. The ballroom doors stood closed. Inside the hall, massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glow. Hundreds of Boston's elite sat at the tables. Eleanor stood in the spotlight at the center of the stage, wearing an incredibly expensive evening gown. Her voice carried over the microphone, a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. Caring for my dear Julian all these years has been the most difficult, yet most sacred mission of my life, she choked out, two incredibly realistic tears rolling down her perfect face. Yet tragedy refuses to leave us. My husband, Arthur, has completely collapsed under the weight of his grief and severe delusions. He refuses to accept Dr. Vance's latest life-saving treatment protocols. To protect this family, I have been forced to make a truly heartbreaking decision. The ballroom was dead silent. Sympathetic eyes locked onto her. Dr. Vance stood in a polished tuxedo in the front row, wearing a mask of deep sorrow. Right then, David's team cut the main stage controls. The spotlight focused on Eleanor instantly died. In its place, the massive LED projection screen at the back of the stage flared to life. The heavy doors to the ballroom were thrown open. I walked into the gala with cold surgical precision, and right beside me walked Julian, no cane, no wheelchair, his pace slow but absolute and unyielding. An immense, suffocating gasp erupted from the crowd. Hundreds of eyes widened in pure shock, staring at the tech heir who was supposed to be permanently paralyzed, now marching toward the stage with his head held high. Eleanor's fake sickening smile froze instantly. Her eyes stretched into wide circles of absolute terror. She opened her mouth, but not a single sound came out, her breath catching squarely in her throat. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring dead at Julian, a ghost who was never supposed to stand. "Mother!" Julian's voice boomed, deep and perfectly steady, amplified by the microphones and rattling the entire ballroom. His tone vibrated with a cold, roaring fury. "You seem incredibly surprised to see me standing." Down in the crowd, Dr. Vance stumbled backward, the color draining completely from his pale face. He let out a pathetic, choked whimper, his dark eyes darting frantically between Julian's standing frame and the sealed exit doors. Eleanor began to shake violently. Her meticulously manicured mask crumbled into a distortion of raw panic. "Julian," she stammered, her voice morphing into a hollow, pathetic shriek. "How? This is impossible. You're paralyzed. You're blind." I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I walked slowly up the stage steps. "He can stand because he's no longer ingesting the heavy livestock sedatives you provided, Eleanor," I said, my voice carrying the lethal calmness of an executioner. I made a single gesture, and a crystal-clear, high-definition projection filled the massive LED screen. It was the expedited toxicology report signed by Dr. Emily Chen. Right next to it were the digital receipts for every single offshore wire transfer that had drained the $15 million trust fund, followed by the luxury property deeds under Dr. Vance's name. A massive wave of gas and furious whispers exploded through the crowd. Eleanor let out a horrifying shriek of panic. She spun around, desperately trying to flee the stage, but her path was instantly cut off. Stepping out from the shadows on both sides of the stage were tactical FBI agents, heavily armed and wearing body armor. Director Miller stood firmly among them, his hand resting calmly on his belt, his eyes locked dead on her. Eleanor stared at the federal agents, her hands shaking violently at her sides. The sudden, massive ambush had completely stolen the air from her lungs, but a master manipulator never surrenders without deploying her final weapon. I watched the calculating gears turning frantically behind her panicked eyes. She drew a ragged breath, sharply shifting her entire posture. The mask of frozen terror melted instantly, replaced by a theatrical display of agonizing grief. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a piercing wail that echoed off the high ballroom ceilings. "What are you doing to him?" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger straight at me, her face contorted into a perfect image of fabricated horror. "He is completely paralyzed. You are forcing him to stand against his will. Agents, you must arrest my husband immediately. He has lost his mind. He is deeply unstable, and he is actively torturing our disabled son. Please, you have to save my poor boy before this unstable father breaks his spine permanently." She lunged desperately forward, trying to wrap her arms around Julian, attempting to force him back into the chemical cage she had built for him. But Director Miller stepped firmly into her path, raising a calloused hand to signal her to stop immediately. Eleanor sobbed loudly, weeping into her palms, playing the role of a devastated mother with sickening perfection. She wailed about my rapidly deteriorating dementia, begging Dr. Vance to confirm her medical claims to the authorities. But Dr. Vance was completely paralyzed by pure, undeniable terror. He stood rigid on the red carpet, his wide eyes locked onto the thick stack of federal arrest warrants in David's hand. The disgraced doctor knew exactly what those stamped documents meant for his future. His lucrative real estate empire and fabricated medical career were turning to ash right before his sweating face. The only sound in the massive ballroom was Eleanor's desperate screaming, but her frantic performance was abruptly cut short by a single, perfectly calm voice. "Stop the sickening act." The quiet command didn't come from me, and it didn't come from the agents. It came directly from Julian. His voice was deep, clear, and carried a profound inner strength that held absolute authority over the incredibly tense room. Eleanor froze instantly. Her dramatic sobbing stopped dead in her throat. She slowly lowered her trembling hands and looked up at the tall, imposing son she had systematically poisoned for 7 long years. Julian looked down at her. His expression was completely void of any lingering childhood affection or fear. He looked at her exactly the way a seasoned judge looks at a criminal before handing down the final sentence. "I have been completely aware and fully lucid for a very long time," he said smoothly, his incredibly steady words cutting cleanly through the suffocating tension. "I have listened silently in the dark hallway outside my bedroom to every single malicious phone call you made. I know absolutely everything about the forced medical guardianship you were preparing to file on Monday morning, and I know exactly how you ruthlessly drained the $15 million trust fund my mother left for me." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words formed. All the color drained from her beautiful face, leaving a sickening ashen gray. She looked exactly like a cornered animal. Realizing the trap had permanently closed, she looked back desperately at Dr. Vance, searching for any possible shred of salvation. But the disgraced doctor had already slowly raised his trembling hands toward the heavily armed federal agents, a pathetic gesture of absolute final surrender. I walked very slowly toward the center of the stage, carefully smoothing the lapels of my dark suit. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I turned and displayed the final slide to the elite crowd. "This," I stated with absolute coldness, "is a bank transfer record from exactly 7 years ago. The recipient was a corrupt dive equipment mechanic on Martha's Vineyard. The amount was $100,000 in cash. The transfer was made exactly 2 days before Julian's accidental oxygen deprivation." Dead silence fell over the massive room. Eleanor stared blankly at the ink on the massive screen. Her fake sobbing stopped completely, instantly replaced by a sudden, terrifying inability to draw basic oxygen into her tightened lungs. "You didn't just want to keep him close. You wanted absolute, unrestricted control over his $15 million medical trust, and you wanted his mother's tech empire," I stated smoothly, my deep voice echoing with lethal, unforgiving clarity. "You meticulously engineered a horrific, devastating human catastrophe. You deliberately starved his brain of oxygen, cold-bloodedly destroying his entire bright future. And then, you comfortably spent nearly 3,000 days actively feeding him heavily restricted livestock sedatives, ruthlessly ensuring he would never, ever walk or see again." Even the hardened veteran federal agents standing in the shadows looked visibly sickened, their stern faces twisting in deep, undeniable disgust at the trembling woman. Eleanor didn't attempt to loudly deny the horrifying, monstrous truth I had just fully exposed. She slowly tore her wide eyes away from the massive screen and looked up desperately at the tall, powerful figure standing in the spotlight. She reached out a trembling, perfectly manicured hand toward him, her failing voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whimper. "Julian, my poor stepson, please, you have to listen to me." Julian looked down at the woman who had stolen his youth. He didn't flinch, and he didn't offer her shaking, outstretched hand a single ounce of sympathetic eye contact. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step backward, pulling his impeccably tailored sweat jacket away from her clawing fingers, as if her physical touch were a highly toxic, corrosive acid. "You are not my mother, and you are not my stepmother," Julian stated, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any lingering emotion. "You are my warden. You are an evil monster. Take her away." This firm, authoritative command from the victim of her malicious crimes marked the absolute end of the carefully orchestrated theatrical performance. Director Miller gave a stern nod to two uniformed agents. They moved forward with swift, uncompromising efficiency, their heavy tactical boots thudding loudly against the carpet. One agent grabbed her right arm firmly, violently hauling her up from her kneeling position, while the second agent quickly seized her left wrist, twisting it securely behind her back. Heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around her pale wrists. The sharp, highly distinct metallic click echoed through the spacious ballroom, marking the absolute end of her reign of terror. "You have the right to remain silent," the tall agent recited calmly. The mask of refined elegance and wealthy superiority shattered instantly into a million sharp, irreparable pieces. She began to struggle violently against the unyielding grip of the seasoned agents, her expensive designer evening gown twisting and tearing as she kicked frantically at the empty air. She screamed with everything she had, a harsh, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage and absolute desperation. She viciously cursed my name. She cursed Vance's cowardly surrender, and she screamed vile, malicious insults at Julian, the same boy she had tearfully called out to just a second before. She fought like a rabid-cornered predator. The agents didn't hesitate or waver. They dragged her roughly, kicking and screaming, straight across the polished floor, forcibly hauling her out of the gala she had so desperately hoped would cement her status. I stood quietly beside my son, watching with a cold, methodical satisfaction as the violent struggle moved quickly across the hall and vanished through the heavy glass doors. David stepped forward, offered a brief, highly professional nod of approval, and turned to follow them out, ensuring the meticulous booking process went exactly according to plan. Later that night, we returned to the sprawling Brookline estate. The heavy, massive house, which had once been a suffocating prison of deception and chemical torture, suddenly felt incredibly peaceful. My gaze drifted slowly toward the deep corner of the room, landing directly on a heavy medical bed with complex restraints. It was the absolute physical symbol of her profound evil. It sat completely empty in the shadows. I didn't say a single word to Julian. I turned and walked with a deliberate, heavy step to the garage. I grabbed a massive, solid steel sledgehammer. Walking slowly back to the medical wing, I raised the heavy sledgehammer high over my shoulder and brought it down with devastating, explosive physical force, directly onto the center of the heavy metal bed frame. The loud, violent crash of breaking metal echoed loudly through the empty house. I swung the sledgehammer again and again, completely shattering the malicious mattress and violently reducing the hated instrument of our long suffering into a twisted, unrecognizable pile of scrap metal. I finally stepped back, feeling an incredibly massive, unbelievable weight finally lift from my aging shoulders. "It's over," I panted heavily, looking down at the wreckage. Julian stepped forward, offering a truly genuine smile for the first time in 7 years. "No, Dad, it's just beginning." Julian was absolutely right. The complete destruction of that heavy medical bed was not the peaceful conclusion of our long journey. It was the sounding gun for a ruthless, highly systematic campaign for absolute justice. The next few weeks moved at a dizzying pace, a whirlwind of federal prosecutions, brutal courtroom battles, and ultimate, undeniable vindication. Eleanor and Vance were stripped of their lavish lifestyles overnight, thrown headfirst into the cold reality of the criminal justice system. The mountain of irrefutable evidence David and I had methodically gathered proved impossible to overcome. They faced federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, massive medical fraud, and grand embezzlement. Looking down from his bench with visible disgust, the judge handed down a ruthless, ironclad sentence. Both Eleanor and Dr. Vance were sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, with absolutely no possibility of parole. They were led away in heavy chains, entirely broken and stripped of their dignity. Following their conviction, we went after the trust bank that had turned a blind eye to the suspicious transfers, exposing their gross institutional negligence. Terrified of a massive public relations disaster, they quickly settled out of court, completely restoring Julian's stolen $15 million trust fund. But the real battle took place outside the sterile walls of courts and banks. After 7 years of forced chemical paralysis, Julian's body required a monumental, painful effort to rebuild its lost strength. We immediately enrolled him in an intensive physical therapy program designed for extreme trauma recovery. The rehabilitation process was brutal. Every morning I stood in the bright, open gym, watching him push his recovering muscles to the absolute breaking point. There were days when his trembling legs simply gave out, and he would crash heavily onto the thick blue mats, drenched in sweat and tears of frustration. But I was always there to catch him. "You're doing great, son," I would say softly, wiping his forehead with a cool towel. "You're building an armor they can never pierce again." The long, cold winter slowly gave way to a bright, hopeful spring. Exactly 1 year later, a crisp, vibrant morning swept through the city. I sat comfortably behind the wheel of my perfectly restored vintage Land Rover Defender, the steady, warm hum of the heavy engine vibrating in my chest. I drove into downtown Boston and pulled up in front of a grand, futuristic skyscraper made of glass and steel. Julian stepped out of the vehicle with quiet confidence. He walked with a slight residual limp in his right leg, a permanent physical reminder of the trauma he had survived. But he didn't let it slow him down. He leaned gracefully on a sleek, highly polished wooden cane, his grip steady on the silver handle. Today was his first day taking over his late mother's legacy as the CEO of her tech company, preparing to ring the opening bell for their highly anticipated IPO. He looked up, staring directly at the towering, gleaming headquarters. Standing quietly beside him, I felt an overwhelming wave of pure fatherly pride. He was no longer the helpless victim trapped in a metal cage. He was a triumphant, independent survivor. We didn't need a grand emotional speech or heavy tears on the busy sidewalk. We simply turned to each other and shared a brief, powerful embrace. He turned back toward the entrance, gripped his cane, and walked with a steady, unyielding purpose straight through the massive glass revolving doors. I watched his tall figure vanish completely into the bustling corporate crowd. Closing my eyes, I took a deep breath of the crisp, clean morning air. The dark shadows of our past were gone forever. The most dangerous enemies are rarely strangers hiding in dark alleys. Often they are the ones sleeping right beside us, disguised in masks of love and care. True malice knows exactly how to manipulate our deepest trust, but no lie, no matter how perfectly constructed, can withstand the piercing light of the truth. When your intuition tells you something is wrong, taking decisive action is the only way to protect the people you love.